Welcome, everyone. My name is Madeline No, and I'm with NetHope. We want to welcome you to another NetHope Solutions Center webinar. And today our topic is, what do program data and ordering a pizza have in common? Today, we are pleased to welcome NetHope member organization Oxfam to present the information to us today. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping guidelines for our session today. Please keep this interactive. Open your Zoom chat window and put your comments and questions there for our Q&A session toward the end of the hour. Also, look for a follow-up email later today or tomorrow that will include a link to the NetHope Solutions Center landing page that will have the recording and any links and information and resources for you that you can follow up with later and share widely with your colleagues. Also, please take a moment to complete our webinar satisfaction poll that will be presented after the webinar today. Your feedback is very important to us, and we hope that you will take just a moment to give us that. Before we get started with our presentation, we'd like to ask who's in our virtual room. I'm going to launch a poll, and if you take a moment to answer. See your answers coming through. Thank you. We'll give it another few seconds. Excellent. All right, I'll close that. And it looks like we have a majority from one sector. And now I would like to hand it off to my colleague, Layla Toplik, who is head of Emerging Technologies Initiative at NetHope. Layla?
Thank you so much, Madeline, and welcome. Great to see so many representatives from the nonprofit sector because this webinar is for you. Now, before we hear from our colleagues at Oxfam, I want to give you just brief context for this webinar and also talk about what comes next after the webinar. So the reason why we're focusing on data today is because data, as many of you in the nonprofit sector will say, is key to pretty much everything that we do. The better we manage and apply data, the more our programs and services improve, serving more people in need, and also delivering more value to those that we're already supporting. And data also helps us improve future programming and predict future needs. So nonprofits, like 85% of you that are on this call today, and many of your NetHope members, really need to be data-driven in their work in order to deliver on their missions. And this webinar is actually part of a series of conversations that we've been having on this topic of data at NetHope. We have 3 working groups that talk about data on a regular basis. We have AI working group, InfoSec, and data applications working group. And in the recent round of consultations with the leads of those working groups, with the NGOs and a few other NGOs, we actually discussed the key considerations and steps that can help nonprofit sector manage and utilize data more effectively and also responsibly. What you're seeing on this slide is actually one of the links is a summary of those key findings and resources, and Seth is sharing that in the chat window. But it's really the insights that came out of those consultations that inspired this specific webinar. We heard that some of the biggest barriers to nonprofit data maturity include lack of trust, surrounding the quality, the flow, the use of data. Second, the inability to operationalize data and to use it strategically due to skills, processes, incentives. And third, an absent organization-wide data strategy. As a result, what we heard from our members is that there's a massive gap between the available data and the ability to use it effectively. So today, one of our members, Oxfam, that participated in the consultations, has offered to share their approach and their learnings related to closing this gap between the available data and the ability to use data responsibly and effectively. And they'll specifically focus on one of the issues that many of our members and nonprofit organizations struggle with, which is really data fragmentation across different and disparate data sources and cumbersome data analysis that ultimately make data-driven decision-making quite challenging. Now, just briefly, in terms of what comes after the webinar, we hope that this specific webinar, this presentation from Oxfam, and thank you to the team from Oxfam, that this will actually inspire many of you in the nonprofit sector to share your approaches and learnings at NetHope Summit this November. We'll have a data-focused working session at the summit, and we'd like to invite nonprofits to share how they're addressing data fragmentation, as well as other challenges related to managing and utilizing data. We also, as a group, hope to explore potential topics for collective and multi-agency collaboration. So if you are interested after this session, feel free to email me, and Seth will put my email in the chat window. Now, next slide, please. So with that, with this brief context, it's my pleasure to introduce the feature presentation for today. And this will be driven by Amy O'Donnell, Digital Program Lead from Oxfam, and Rick Thai, Digital Program Advisor at Oxfam. Also, Melton, who's in the Philippines, where it's really late right now, is joining us via a pre-recorded video. With that, I'll hand it over to Rick.
Cool, thank you very much. So I will share my screen. So hopefully you can see my slides now. If I can just get a quick yes from somebody, that would be lovely.
Yes. Yes.
Brilliant. So hello to everyone who's joined this session. So I'm going to sort of start off here and just sort of set the scene a little bit for the work we've done over the last few years. And really, it started with a problem that I think is quite familiar to a lot of people, which is we talk more and more in our organizations about making data-driven decisions, which is a really nice kind of theory and concept, but the reality, particularly on the ground in our country programs is, that's not a simple thing to do. And we had spent a number of years working on really focusing on getting some common data capture tools. So some examples here with Survey CTO and Mabenzi around our mobile surveys. We have Helios around supply chain data. And then we work closely with LMMS from World Vision and Red Rose around capturing sort of program participant data, distribution tracking, cash and e-vouchers. So we'd spent a lot of time and effort kind of really narrowing down to a few very good tools that did the job for us around data collection. But then what that left was this kind of hole in the middle around where does this data actually go? So we've got secure systems, we've got relatively good quality data coming in, but then what do we do with it? And usually there is some poor soul, or maybe if you're lucky, a team of poor souls, perhaps on the meal side, whose job it is to try and make sense of all these different and disparate bits of data which are coming in. And it becomes these very manual extraction processes a lot of the time. There's not necessarily common coding between the systems. And particularly with that, with the manual processes and a lot of personal data potentially being moved, there are data security and data privacy risks through that, and not necessarily the kind of checks and balances that you would like to see. So that was the problem we kind of identified and were looking at. And so what we wanted to do, and as a potential way forward for us, was this idea of building a hub, a data hub for us, which is a way of automating some of this data extraction and aggregation where possible, and where preferred, and that's something I'll come on to a little bit later, but also building in the privacy by design. So trying to automate some of those extraction and processing steps so that the meal teams can actually spend the time analyzing data rather than doing all those manual processes, and also allowing us to open up this kind of reporting hopefully to a wider audience, so it isn't just such a narrow group who kind of control the data. And then as part of that automation, we could also build in privacy as a core element of this processing, so reducing the risk to the those vulnerable people we're working with. So this was our grand kind of vision. All these systems would be pushing into a central hub which people can access and report from. As a practical step, we kind of took a sort of simple step. Rather than trying to do it all in one go, we just picked one route through the system. So this was in 2017. We embarked on our initial data hub build, and there was a very small amount of build here. And it's we used Survey CTO, so one of our standard tools, and made use of their existing webhook functionality. So we didn't have to build or ask them to build anything from that side. The webhook pushes data through to our existing Azure setup. So on the Oxfam side, we use Microsoft Azure. That was already in place as well. And then we were using Power BI to do the visualization. So relatively kind of off-the-shelf tools. The only bit of kind of actual development we did was to build a small web application which sits within Azure, and it receives the data coming in from Survey CTO, kind of checks where it's coming from as a first kind of security check, routes it through to the correct country database. So we've kept that segregation of data between different countries. And what it also does, it has it is a basic element, but it's a privacy kind of wrapper. So what it will do is remove things like names, phone numbers, addresses, that kind of thing, because we don't need that for the aggregation. So we have a number of checks along the way. Ideally, we don't collect that data if we don't need it in Survey CTO. If it has to be collected, we do, but then ideally we don't push it through the webhook because it's not needed for aggregate reporting. If someone has pushed it through, hopefully the data hub then catches it and removes it. And then we also have kind of gatekeeper roles on the Power BI side to try and make sure, again, there's a final step there to make sure we're not publishing any identifiable data as much as possible. So that's the route we set up in 2017. It has been up and running since that point. And so far we've had around 20 countries making use of this kind of first version of the hub. And we've had, I think, a bit over 300,000 sort of data submissions. So it's not huge data, certainly not, when you start thinking about the needs of AI and machine learning and stuff. But for us, this was a good proof of concept on how we can take data from a source system, put it in a central repository, and then use Power BI for the reporting on that. And this is just a few snapshots from some of the dashboards we have built in Power BI. So we've been using it primarily, so a lot of this came about from an accountability project called Your Word Counts, which people may have heard of from other presentations before, where we collect feedback data from communities through Survey CTO, and we use the case management functionality there. And what we've used the data over here for is collating data from multiple Survey CTO servers. So each operating country has its own server. That data is collated in one place on the data hub, and then we can build our reporting from it. It's a similar idea with our community perception tracker dashboard here, which again is taking information from communities from, as you can see, a variety of different countries, collating it in one place, and then presenting it for the reporting. And then the example at the bottom, it's a little while ago now, but this is from Indonesia, from a humanitarian response, where we were collecting data. It was one response in one country, but it was data from multiple sectors, from multiple teams. And again, a nice use of a very sort of simple, straightforward survey tool, nice reporting. But this was actually, this dashboard here at the bottom was presented in the kind of reception area of the office. So as people came in the morning during the response, everyone could see what was going on in their program, which was definitely a nice way of broadening the audience for this kind of reporting, making it more accessible for people, and certainly allowing, you know, often our WASH team will know what's going on in their area and livelihoods will know their piece. But this was just nice in the morning. You could get a snapshot of what was happening kind of across the program. And again, nothing too technical here. It's relatively easy to set up once you've kind of gone through some of that thought process in standard coding between the different programs and functions. So that's just setting the scene a little for where we started, what we've designed and built and have been using, you know, through till now, and these systems are up and running as I speak. So I'll stop there with the background. I think next step, we've just got another poll. So it's our second one, and this is just for us to get a bit of a feel for which other tools are in use out there within the sector. So we've set up this connection from Survey CTO to the Data Hub as it exists. I guess we were just interested to know what common tools exist out there, where we could you know, share learning, and, you know, if one organization gets this running for themselves, can we share it amongst others? So this was just, as I say, a case of trying to figure out who's using what. So I can go through and take a few that we're using. Okay. I don't know how quickly we can get the results on seeing that through. Ah, brilliant. So obviously a lot of Kobo users, and that's definitely one we see across a number of our programs as well. And we've done some experiments between Kobo and the Data Hub. But good to see, yeah, some of the commonality across, particularly the data, I guess, the mobile data collection tools around Survey CTO, Comcare, ODK. Right, at that point, I will stop and I'm going to hand over to Amy.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much, in particular to NetHope for hosting us today, and Rick for taking us so far on our journey. And it really is great to see how many of you have joined, and really looking forward to future collaboration and sharing learning on all of these fantastic tools and approaches that you're already starting to share in the chat box. So I thought I'd just kick off by recapping where we are on our journey, and sort of take us up to some of the current steps and where we're hoping to go in the future. So as you'll have heard Rick say, it was around 2016 when we realized we had this big black hole problem when it came to lots of different data entry points and no way of correlating those. And it was 2017 that we tested our first connector in the Data Hub, and used the fantastic NetHope Summit in Dublin 2018 to begin some dialogue around what are the conditions for effective artificial intelligence, actually. And a big part of our learning was actually, let's take a step back and start with some of our small data and build some really strong foundations so that the data quality is really there and the connections are really there before we start asking some of these kind of larger, big scale questions about the future potential of that data. And it was in 2019 that, I'm not sure whether Eric Arnold's on the call, but who's a member of NetHope, who works with Microsoft, we began some conversations around how we could use the fact that we already had chosen Power BI and were working with Microsoft Azure as our foundational tools to look at ways that we might improve some of that data architecture. And they have a partner called Adatis, some really fantastic thinkers who really help translate the methodology and putting people first in terms of how we work out some of those data flows. That led us to this fantastic workshop that we ran in Manila in the Philippines, where we really wanted to focus in on the human story, the program managers, the monitoring and evaluation, accountability and learning colleagues, what their perspective was. How about the perspective of our partners and the communities that we work with? We knew that we had to ground it somewhere. And it was the findings of that workshop that also led us to what was then the Department for International Development with John Adams, but now the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office. We actually ran a workshop in London on the International Aid Transparency Initiative that really helped us further that dialogue and conversation. And we also shared learning at MELTEC, the Monitoring, Evaluation, Research and Learning event in Washington, DC, which was a great chance to connect with many others and many of you who might well be on this call. So as Rick says, by last month, our last count was 20 countries actively using the Data Hub. And now we're at a place where we're really deep diving, and we'll hear in the video from Melton about where we're going now with our team in the Philippines in developing out that dashboard and looking at some further connections beyond Service ETO. And we really hope this is also setting the foundations for some future collaboration, whether that's the event that we're planning and thinking about together at the NetHope Summit in November. Could we actually form some kind of collaborative network to work together on piloting our approaches, meet regularly, talk about standards, think about strong representation of our local partners, or indeed, who are the kind of data hub-like frameworks? Where are those sort of decisions held? How can we actually have some kind of collective governance on the support, maintenance, and sustainability of this as a model? And just a final point on this, I think many of us in the nonprofit sector, particularly in international development, are on a real journey towards rethinking our practice and thinking about what it means to shift power to the communities with whom we work. Much of that involves working with local partners and taking a lot less of a kind of extractive approach to our data collection and really building in respect and dignity for people's data and collaborative working models. So this, as a principle, really does sit at the heart of where this future is going, and one where I think that we can set the stage for ways in which data can be a lot more democratized and a lot more held in the hands and used by the communities, the partners, the very people who are making impact that are part of our networks. Thank you, Madeline, if you wouldn't mind clicking to the next slide. So many of us haven't been on a plane for quite some while, so I'd like you to close your eyes and imagine you're on your way to the beautiful Manila in the Philippines, which is where we were for our workshop that really set the groundwork for the next stage, moving from the architectural decisions that Rick's kind of outlined into the dreaming and the design from our program perspective. We needed to be grounded by that program reality, so we weren't just abstract. And we really believe in the principles of nothing about us without us. So we're people orientated and we get that participation from the outset. We knew we couldn't do that with every single country, but we knew the Philippines was a context where there was a largely partner-led approach. We had a great deal of diversity in terms of data sharing and management needs. And they were active users of our Your Word Counts feedback methodology that Rick also mentioned earlier. And not least, there was a great deal of energy from the people and the individuals, the time commitment and the leadership support. And our colleague Melton is based just around the corner in Davao in the Philippines. And this picture here, you can see every good workshop starts with an acronym wall, where we were working with Microsoft and with Adatis, these tech companies, and we at times were really struggling with our joined up language. So we started with this fantastic acronym wall that just grew and grew throughout the workshop, but it was a really great way of bridging our mutual understanding. Thank you, Madeline. The first thing that Adatis, who really helped us with the structure of the webinar, helped us to do was to begin by dreaming. Dream, what would that perfect data-enabled reality look like for you? Imagine if our system was one that donors could trust, so that we could share some of our unedited data and information without revealing anything personal or put any individuals at risk. What if some of that personal data redaction was automatically protected in some of our systems? What if there were ways that those reports could feed other reports in turn, so we weren't manually approaching every single donor or every single reporting need one by one, case by case, but imagine if we could join those up. Imagine if we didn't have those silos and partners could actually directly access some of this data rather than being held by one INGO who had all of the power. Imagine if we had a beautiful visual map. Isn't that what everybody wants? Imagine if we could share some of our tacit and informal knowledge and project learning and get that long
We lose Amy.
Oh,
Amy?
hello. Oh,
Hi,
am I back?
we lost the last sentence, if you don't mind repeating. Thank you.
Oh, sorry. What if, most importantly, we could close that feedback loop back to communities and individuals, so we were less extractive in our data collection processes and really got back to people? So I'd just like to ask you, how much of this feels familiar? Thank you, Madeline. On to the next slide. And the question that I wonder if, I hope encouraged you to join this webinar and that we've all been waiting for, what is this link between data and pizza? I'm worried that some people are wondering whether we're going to somehow bring some pizza to this online webinar through our computers. Unfortunately, it's a case of bring your own pizza if you're getting hungry. But here we go. I'll have a go at explaining why we think there is a link between ordering a pizza and program data. So this really all credit to Adatis, who helped us think through this process, where they really set out to say, every data mapping that you conduct looks at some basic steps. And if you imagine that when you ring up a pizza joint to order that pizza, you might first think, well, who are we involving here? Well, it might be a customer. It might be me, Amy, about what I want to eat for my dinner. What is it? Controversial. I like pineapple and ham on my pizza. What size is that pizza? Medium. How many do I want? 1. Where should it be delivered? My house. When? Today at 7. Okay, this seems straightforward, Amy. What's your point? What are you getting on about? Madeline, if you could click, please, to say that we actually use the same principle to get down to that granular level of empathetically sitting in the shoes of our program colleagues and really taking those steps one by one, case by case, around what it was we were trying to do. So we did this through very specific programmatic activities and examples. So in a similar way, who, a program participant, wants to have what? A cash distribution. On to what end? Project, be ready, project, you enter it. Who, from which donor? What do we need to know about that donor that we need to report back to? How many? What's the actual spend of that cash distribution project? What's the modality of the distribution? Maybe it's a cash card. We use Red Rose, for example. Where? Let's locate the point on the map. When? At that date, and the spend between certain dates. So as you can see, there are real parallels between ordering a pizza and helping us think about the who, what, where, why, when, how of how we look at program data on a individual project granular level that then helps us build upwards from there. And in this picture, you can see that luckily when we were in Manila, we did indeed get some pizza. We finally got it. I've only starred the faces of these participants because I couldn't get their permission to share, but there in the middle, you can see me, Rick and Melton very happy about eating our pizza. So I hope I'm not making you too hungry as we click to the next slide, please, Madeline, to share that this level of granularity as we were mapping, and we did this for a number of different activities, helped us see there were different types of data at that project level about what we would need to provide, what data was flowing through our projects. The logic being that if we could get accurate reporting at the project level, we could aggregate upwards to program, country, and even global levels, and make that project, that data work for that level of granularity that we see. Of course, the further up that chain you go, the greater the risk of losing that narrative and that context, but this was still helpful for us. So you can see it covered everything from satisfaction to identity, supply chain management, financials, program management data, right down to the levels of what was the account code, what was the question you asked, or the answer that you received. And this really helped us break down the kind of levels of the data that we saw. Thank you, Madeline. This mapping then helped us to identify the key requirements from the team in the Philippines. And for them, they really wanted to see a project level dashboard to help them monitor activity progress and feed into their program design, help them make decisions, as we've discussed, real-time decisions or near real-time decisions, as the project is in motion, not 6 months down the line when we have to report to our donor. And we also had lots of conversations about improving our ability to share data with others, with the local partners, with communities, with other NGOs that were operational in that space. And throughout all of this was this real fundamental priority of protecting the data of individuals that we were working with. So this rather messy picture on the right-hand side is a mocked up version of what that team really wanted to be able to see. And for me, it was also a real reminder of the journey that says the visual is the easy part. The hard part is the data that goes into fueling that visual and sitting behind that and keeping that maintained and clean and up to date. That only then will this visual make serve any purpose or use. And what we did was actually conclude that from this variety of granular levels of detail, there were 3, and we've cheekily actually said we think 4 crucial clusters of things that we needed to measure, allowing us to report on whether a program is really working. So as you can see, these are the financials, namely, what did you spend? The delivery or outputs, what did we deliver with that spend? In our case, that might be something like, how many toilets did you build? The third is, what was the impact of that spend? So how many people could access those toilets that we built? And finally, was that what people wanted? When we do surveys and report on satisfaction, did communities think that toilet was built in the right place or meet the right needs? What would we learn for next time? So I guess in some ways there's a challenge to say, have we missed anything? Are there other clusters of programmatic data that don't necessarily fill these 4 clusters or areas of data granularity? Could we add more, or could we see mapping that could fit those different types of thing into that same structure? And Madeline, I think now we're going to go on to our final, I
think we might have lost Amy again there. I'll hop in unless she reappears. But this is, I'm just going to introduce a quick video from Melton, so a colleague from our team based in the Philippines, just to talk through a bit more about the practical steps that have been taken by the Philippines team working with Melton over the last kind of year or so to start bringing some of this to reality.
Hello everyone, my name is Melton Llanos. I'm from Oxfam GB based in the Philippines. Coming out from the workshop we did together with Microsoft, Adatis and Oxfam Philippines a couple of years ago, we've identified some key challenges in terms of how we manage and make sense of the data that we collect across projects in the country. And one of the questions we had was, what else can we do to further improve quality and efficiency and making sure that information that was given to us by the people in the communities are protected? So we were left with three major challenges. The first one is donors with different data requirements leads to project working in silos in terms of how data is being collected and managed. The second one is projects have different methodologies for setting up data and visuals for their reporting needs, version control issues on databases. So there was a question on how we can troubleshoot for all or how we can establish connections between data sets that have different structures. And lastly, a data extractive relationship instead of collaboration with partners. Given the challenges, how do we find a solution? And this is not just about finding the best tool, but also finding the right balance between our tools and approaches, and also with the current realities on the ground. First, we try not to disrupt how partners currently work, uses existing tools which are safe and not overcomplicated with respect to the existing knowledge capacities. Second is set up templates to encourage some structural coding of data, which is still adaptable through minor tweaking or adding new fields that are unique to the project. And finally, offer different entry points for viewing or accessing the data and reports, like partners have their own report dashboards or combine data from different projects in portfolio reports, or work for more meta-analysis. So the country dashboard is still a work in progress, but we already have 2 projects on board. And then the plan is that we are going to scale this up across all projects in the country. And then this would allow us to aggregate data from partners going up to the project and going up to the country level. Projects can still focus on their work, but through the standardized coding and naming conventions with the templates or tools that we've set up. Hello, everyone.
Oh, there we go. So I'm just going to kind of move quite quickly through a last couple of slides so we can get to some of the discussion, because I can see lots of questions coming in on the chat window that we want to try and get to. But just as I guess, following up from Melton's explanation, what we've been broadly using here is actually, we've got these multiple data capture tools, and in the Philippines, broadly, it's partners using these. Now, some of these are things like Survey CTO and LMMS. So ones where Oxfam are perhaps covering the costs, helping get them set up, but it's partners doing much of the work in terms of the data collection, or it might be their own tools. It might be Kobo, it might be something else that the partner already had in place. And for the Philippines, actually, what they're using at the moment broadly is Box. So a simple tool for sharing data between different organizations. And so the raw extracted data is being loaded into Box by the partners, and this is a manual process. Now, this is something that could have been automated from a lot of these systems, but actually the request from the partners was to have this still as a manual piece, so that they can kind of do that data sweep and kind of check the data before it passes across. So I think it's a nice proof of where, even though something could be automated, the people doing this requested to do it manually, so there is a person check, so that human element stays in. Once the data is in box, then we've got Power Query automation, which takes that raw data and puts it into a number of different templates and summary sheets around kind of participant data, activity data, and what have you. And then those summary sheets and templates, which have been created automatically, are then used for the reporting. And again, that's now an automatic, Power BI connection onto the box files to do that reporting, whether it's internal reporting for our own project monitoring, or maybe donor reporting, and that reporting is also available to the partners. So again, it's trying to find a way of meeting people halfway. So yes, so the templates, summary sheets, so this is all using Box. So it's trying to look at some of the concepts of the wider data hub that we were wanting to get to. This is almost like a data hub 1.1, which is broadening out the number of systems we're getting the data from. Rather than using Azure, though, we're using Box. So it's just a slightly different way of doing it. It's a kind of no code, I guess, way of doing it. And that, again, starts to produce a dashboard, which can serve different project types, but starts to aggregate data from multiple partners, multiple systems. And really, this is about, it's pragmatic. It's trying to use what's there already, trying not to drop necessarily expensive and maintenance heavy tools on top, but it does still improve our security. A Box is a standard tool for us. We can control who has access to what in Box. We can still use Power Query for stripping out identifiable data, and again, manage who has access to the areas with that PII and who just sees the aggregate data beyond. I'm just going to pop through to the third poll, I think potentially the final one. So really just from your perspective, I think potentially, sorry, I've nicked Amy's part here, but just around, we've been thinking about standardizing data, working with different partners, privacy by design. So just interested to know, which are the key priority areas for you to be working on. So give that a couple of minutes for you to enter on the poll, and I'll just bring it up just about at the final slide, so I'll hand back over to it.
Thank you, and sorry I slightly dropped there. And I'm like Rick, keen to get onto the questions. So just a few lessons learned as you're sharing and inputting your own lessons learned. For us, from our perspective, we saw these as really distinct from the people and the technology. And we can see that actually, yes, the vast majority of people there put building a shared common data standards and languages across activities. So maybe this is, sort of linked to what are those data centers or levels of granularity that are shared across. And it was good to see also lots of emphasis on partners there as well. So for us, the main lessons on the people side of things, as opposed to the technology, which Rick will cover, is really putting people first. Technology is the easy bit, so we should emphasize those human stories, meet people where they are, understand their abilities, their time, resources, build a mutual understanding on our language, and navigate this trade-off between standardization, but flexibility that can sit within that. And really that kind of more holistic building up of buy-in and support, whether it's within a large international organization or within a local team, from monitoring and evaluation through to country director. Rick.
Sorry, yeah, and from I guess the technology side, for us, the key ones were, not building something new where a solution already existed. How can we use existing tools in an innovative way rather than building something, shinier? really investing in that data cleaning, the underlying maintenance, that the data stewardship is really, really key to all this. Being open to different data sources. So, you know, we had our core tools in mind when we started all this, as I say, Survey CTO, Mabenzi, LMMS, but then recognizing we need to be able to build in things like Kobo. You know, we saw from the poll, a lot of people are using it. So we need to think about how we can also make this kind of agnostic of a data entry solution. And then the purposes of sessions like this, assuming that we're not alone in facing these problems, wanting to discuss it with the wider sector. And then in terms of our next steps, so for Oxfam, you know, we want to find out what others are doing, who can we learn from, including our particularly our technology partners who we discuss with. We are interested in building in some of the connections to our data hub, you know, if required. And then we're looking at, you know, building out the Philippines example, you know, seeing how far can we take this just using, you know, simple Excel box, Power BI, bit of Power Query across that country program, but also other locations. And again, trying to use it to build traction internally, so with management on the, you know, how this can make a difference, and how something relatively straightforward can have a big impact for us and our partners and the program participants. Amy.
And then for our NetHope community and beyond, it's such a pleasure and a joy to join you all and to begin this first step on a journey of more collaboration and more sharing of that learning. So working up to that summit in November, like Layla outlined, where we hope we can hear from others and share with you all about ideas for addressing data fragmentation and removing barriers to connecting data to decision making. So we really are keen to hear from others that may well have experienced similar issues. And then a longer term vision might be that we have some kind of shared framework for data connections. You know, it doesn't need to rely on one type of data storage solution. It could be multiple, but there could be ways we go with a common ask to some of our tech companies so that we're looking at this collectively. And I've added an image of an airline departures board here intentionally, not only because this is our departures board of what's coming next, but also if you think of the airline industry in the 1980s, many of you might know Michael Duggan, who used to work for Oxfam, is now with Salesforce.org, always used to describe how it wasn't individual airlines that were trying to solve their computer issues in 2018 or their interoperability issues, but actually they said, look, if we need to get flights connected, baggage transfer between airlines to be seamless, it's not just cost effective for us to work at this together, but it's actually fundamentally important for that interoperability. So do we, as NGOs, civil society, find ourselves in the similar boat or plane as the airline industry in the 80s? Thanks so much for listening, and we really look forward to answering some of your questions.
All right, well, thank you so much, Amy and Rick, and obviously Milton, who shared with us the learnings from the Philippines. So we have a few minutes for questions, and I've seen also that Rick has begun responding to some of the questions in the chat window. One of the key things that I do want to call your attention to is that you can follow up with this team using this email that Seth will be sharing in the chat window. It will be also included in the follow-up. Also, again, thanks to the Oxfam team for sharing their approach and learnings related to addressing the issues of data fragmentation. Hopefully this has inspired others to join us at the summit and to share how you're actually approaching closing this gap between the available data and the ability to use it effectively and responsibly. So what we'll do right now, we'll take a few questions, but really encourage you to follow up with this team and then also to join the working session at the summit. So the first question, there are a number of questions about your technology choices. So I'll only pick a few. And I'll focus on specifically Power BI and Azure. Just if you can explain why you chose Power BI as opposed to other BI software options like Tableau was mentioned, and what made you choose Azure Cosmos versus Azure SQL. So Rick, maybe over to you for this question.
Yep, thank you. So with most of those, certainly for Power BI and Azure, the reason for using them was they were already being used around the organization. So Oxfam already had an Azure tenancy and we're using it for lots of other things, so it made sense to build upon that. And the same logic with Power BI. So we had licensing in place, we have agreements with Microsoft. Power BI was, when we started, it was very early in Oxfam's use of Power BI, but the steer we got from our internal sort of IS department was, that's the way we want to head. So can you help us drive towards that, since we were going to be working with country programs? So that's why Azure and Power BI, it was just a pragmatic use of what's there. On the kind of Cosmos route, I did sort of just put a note in the chat window, but again, this was around, because our first data source was survey CTO, so it was data coming in from surveys, and because we have less control over that data, and countries can, as ever, build whatever survey they want, we needed a way of being able to kind of throw any kind of survey data into a place, into a bucket, and then we've tended to use Power BI to make some sense of it. It's not necessarily the ideal way of going about things, but it was a way of getting started. And where we've got systems like, I've mentioned LMMS, which is MySQL based, that would make it a lot easier to build into a more structured kind of SQL database or data warehouse type structure, but we just haven't quite got there yet. One thing I would just add on to that, and I think it does come on to one of the questions that was in the chat around how we've perhaps standardized some of these surveys. So in the example of the accountability reporting, our community perception tracker and the activity tracker, so the 3 dashboards I briefly showed, our team had a certain element of control. We were working with the country teams, so we kind of said, look, there's an 80% core that you need to stick to. This is the core part of the survey. We need these elements, and people were able to add to choice lists a little if they wanted, hopefully not change existing choices, but then there was still freedom to add on other bits for particular projects and countries. So it gave that flexibility between, we could build a global report that kind of covered some core pieces for everyone, but countries still have their own dashboard, which is tailored to them and any additional bits of information that they need.
Wow, thank you so much for also answering additional questions, Cherry. And if you have any other questions about Survey CTO, feel free to follow up using this email and a slide. I'm going to move on to the next question, and it's related to partners. Do partners manage their data, or is that data managed within the larger data ecosystem? And there's obviously the question, and this is from Sarah, about who owns the data. Amy or Rick?
Shall I hop in again, or do you want to take that one, Amy?
I can start us off just to say, I think the framework that Melton has built means that there are different ways that we cut the data and the way that data is sort of uploaded and stored. So partners have their own space on Box where they can actually have control over the data that they're sort of up for sharing. And that means that they are, in very Eurocentric GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation language, the data controller. So they are the ones that are responsible for procuring that data, for formatting surveys, and owning that data, as opposed to a data processor is someone like Oxfam, who then that partner says, we're happy for you to have access to this information so that you can combine it with other partners when we're working in a multi-partner donor reporting scenario, or where we want to join up or link up some learning. So Oxfam would then be a data processor. So that means that we would have different obligations. So we're trying to build this environment where partners have their own control over their own spaces where they're uploading that data, but then there is an intersection and way in which that data can be shared between other partners within that ecosystem. Rick, let me know if I answered that okay, if you've got more to add.
No, I think that's very good. Just equally, We do have the other models where if it's, say, LMMS, that's probably we've signed the agreement. It's our, kind of contract with the supplier. And in that instance, it's probably more we are the controller, though the partners are working in that environment with us. And it's probably a mixture of Oxfam staff and partners collecting data into the same solution. Same for Mabenzi, same for Survey CTO. So in those, it's a bit of a mixture, but the idea being any option can work through this kind of data flow.
Okay, thank you. Sarah, if you have any additional follow-ups, I see you said thank you. That answers your question. Again, about another stakeholder in your ecosystem, there's a question from Chris. Do you open your dashboards to your donors and stakeholders as means of reporting in addition to filling templates? If so, has the response been favorable or advantageous for acquisition?
Rick, go ahead.
Yeah, so certainly a really good example for this was the Indonesia, the activity tracking and the response, because that was a dashboard which was made available to donors directly. And they really liked the concept. They liked being able to go in and see what we were doing. And it was also available to partners, to community organizations, kind of really anyone with a web connection. That isn't necessarily the default we go to, just because in that instance we had a lot of resource on the data stewarding side, and so we could be sure of the data as it was kind of going through live. I think usually that's not quite the case. We don't necessarily have that data stewardship role quite so heavily resourced. And so even though we have the ability to do live sort of data publishing through Power BI, we probably purposefully put in some steps along the way just so we can check, put in some checks and balances, because there's always someone's lent on the zero key or put a decimal place in the wrong, at the wrong point. And we would rather we catch that internally and fix it, and we'll go back and fix it at source, but we want to fix it there rather than particularly a donor or a community organization see that first. So yeah, we still are on the side of caution, I would say.
Great, thanks for bringing up that example, Amy. I'm sure you have also quite a bit to add on this topic, so I'll encourage Chris to follow up with both of you using this email. We're actually out of time for more questions. I do want to thank our presenters and the team from Oxfam for sharing their approach, their journey, where they're at, what they're learning, and inviting pretty much all of you, as many of you, about 85% of you are from the nonprofit sector, to share and to join us also at the summit for a working session. With that, I'm going to hand it over to Madeline to wrap up this webinar. Thank you.
Thank you, Layla, and thank you to Amy and Rick for a very informative presentation today. Thanks so much. And thanks to all of our attendees. Thanks for taking the time to join us. Please take a moment to complete your webinar satisfaction poll. It should pop up at the end of your Zoom program, and give us your feedback. We consider it very important. Also look for that follow-up email that will include a link to direct you back to the webinar landing page where you can watch the recording and access the resources that we provided during today's session. And with that, I thank you again for attending, and we wish you a great rest of your day. Thank you.